A380 is a science fair project. Pretty expensive science fair project, William.
Yeah, Riz, thanks. I think it's unfair to call it a science fair project. I do think there's risk, however, in the program. I think many of the analysts, including myself and my firm and people like Richard, believe the A380 may not be the airplane of the future. But I think no one is smart enough to know and predict the future that far out. That airplane will be flying for 30 years. It'll be in production for probably 20. And there's a chance that in 3 years, 5 years, or 8 years, there'll be so much capacity constraint in places like Heathrow that every airline on Earth will be clamoring and waiting in line for years for the aircraft. But it's also possible that's the wrong business model. It's possible it'll be point to point, and the high fare, high yield business, first class traffic won't be near that airplane. It'll be on a Dreamliner, maybe on an A350.
Well, of course, they're hedging their bets on their Airbus with the A350 here, but the 787, what do you make of that?
Great airplane, great technology needed. If Boeing didn't launch that airplane, it may have been the end long term of Boeing commercial. The 747 has passed its peak. It'll get updated. It's a great freighter. It'll fly for a decade more. But it's not new technology. It's not composite. It's not a high performance motor like the new motor on the Dreamliner.
Let's move it along. Okay, we've got Airbus and Boeing. It's an effective duopoly when it comes to commercial aviation, especially for the larger passenger aircraft out there. That's about really, where the duopoly model stops. Elsewhere in the industry, what we do see is, well, several players. Let's take, for instance, have a look at the supply chain. Have a look at that. What do you see happening with, really, at the moment, people supplying the likes of Honeywell, United Technologies, etc.?
Riz, great question. That's really where Alderman and Company specializes. That's what we do. We deal deep in that supply chain, second and third tier supply chain. And so what we see very closely from our clientele who sell to the Boeings and sell to the Honeywells of this world, we see massive consolidation. We akin it to the drugstore phenomenon in the United States, where there used to be what we call a mom and pop drugstore on every corner, and now it's a national franchise. They're called Walgreens, CVS, some other national franchise. In the UK, it would be Boots. We think that model's going the same way. We think the small aerospace supplier is probably long-term no longer going to exist. That the airlines have started the process with deregulation. They are cost sensitive to the penny, to the less than penny per seat mile cost, CASM, C-A-S-M, cost per available seat mile. They're pushing the suppliers like Airbus and Boeing, who are then pushing their suppliers. And what we are seeing is the engine manufacturers, the wheel and brake manufacturers, the avionics manufacturers are then pushing on their suppliers to bring costs down further. And that's forcing more and more consolidation.
Ultimately, it's the airlines are not merging, though, right now.
No, the airlines are not. We see U.S. Airways getting bought out of bankruptcy by America West. We see the Star Alliance trying to do things in a coordinated fashion. But we believe at Alderman & Company this will take decades more before we get, quote-unquote, rid of the unnecessary capacity in the airline industry.
Well, let's talk. You mentioned about jet engine manufacturers there. We've got four major ones, Snecma in France, of course, Pratt & Whitney from United Technologies, GE, and, of course, Rolls-Royce as well. Now, I was interviewing Pratt & Whitney, and they are really looking now to the single-aisle future after the A320, the 737 aircraft. If they don't get that, what happens to them?
Well, Pratt & Whitney has not invested like Rolls or GE for about a decade. Pratt makes terrific motors, especially for the U.S. military and its allies, and they make great commercial engines, but they're mostly legacy programs, and Pratt & Whitney has not invested the new dollars like Rolls or GE. And in this industry, if you don't invest, eventually you lose market share. You can make the argument for the 747 that Boeing was resting on those laurels too long, which gave an opportunity to Airbus to come in with new technology A380. Which forced Boeing in turn to respond with the Dreamliner. And so you invest heavy capital in this industry or you eventually lose share. And although Pratt makes a great motor and has great engineering, they've not been investing like their competition.
Okay, for consolidation there, then, well, let's put it this way. Which of the two which are going to actually be the long-term survivors as far as this goes, and will we get a duopoly is what I'm also asking you here?
Hard to predict, Riz. I think that there is a chance we'll have an engine duopoly. If I was to bet, I wouldn't bet a lot of my chips right now. I don't know how it's going to play out, but I'd start to bet low ante that GE and Rolls-Royce will remain independent, and the future for Pratt & Whitney is less certain, I believe, than for Rolls and for GE.
Let's move it along. You mentioned what was going on with America West. It's, of course, taking over U.S. Airways there in the U.S. But this is about Embraer and Bombardier here, isn't it, as well? Now, I want to talk about Embraer first of all. It's one of the biggest customers there is U.S. Airways. Is that order safe given this merger?
Well, the data we have at the moment, Riz, shows there's 301 orders that are firm for the larger Embraer line, 170, 175, 190, 195. 301 firm orders. Of that, our count is that there are 85 aircraft in the U.S. Airways system. We think they're at risk. We think that anytime you emerge from a U.S. bankruptcy hearing into a merger with another carrier, there's risk for change, whether it's a push out, delay, cancellation, deferral, change in the order profile. We think that order has risk to it. We would not say the entire order is at risk.
Now, Bombardier's C-Series here, will it fly?
That's a tough call. And the issue is that Embraer, we think, has made a very smart move. They have stated publicly that they will not compete with Airbus or Boeing, which means they're not coming into the A319 or the 737-600 series, which is about 118 seats. So that's the top of the Embraer business model, and I think it's a very smart, competitive model. On the other hand, Bombardier is saying they're going right after it. They're going right into the higher line, competing with Airbus and Boeing, and that could be very dangerous.
William, thank you very much indeed. William Alderman, the president of Alderman and Company, joining me here at Le Bourget. Back to you, Mark.
Rich, thanks. More from Rich later. Recapping our top story this hour, Morgan Stanley's chief executive, Philip Hassan.